Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and we're talking about the method section, the measures. First, I want to look at the draft. I got it to pull up once I stopped recording. So this shows you how things get formatted. The method heading is a level 1 heading, meaning it's in the middle. Again, check the template. If the template looks different when you do this, it may be because some of APA style might change. So minor change them. Excuse me, I'm not going to redo the videos. Participants is a level 2 heading, meaning it's over to the left. And you can see I say the sample will include, and I say participants will report, and here I give an example where you need to identify as male or female to be included. And I do say that they will be allowed to choose as many designations as they wish, or write in another one. It's up to you if you include that. You might just give them set options, but just be aware of what you're doing when you do that. Like I said, if I just gave these options, there would be no good thing for me to, if I was filling it out for my son, I wouldn't know what to pick because he doesn't fit in any one of these categories. But you also, I'm not going to let you just say they'll fill in their race because there are some serious research issues with that. Because it's, in my mind, it's worse for you to decide how to group things together or for you to not be able to give any sort of meaningful report of race than to force people to choose categories. So just be as mindful as you can as you're creating these options. Pay attention to what goes in parentheses and what's italicized as you go. I've tried, the APA manual, at least the 6th edition, is not always clear on certain formatting things. So I've done my best to figure out what they mean to be as detail-oriented as possible. So try to follow as close as you can to what I've done. If what's in the template, I've updated it a little bit, so if it's different from the sample papers, try to follow what's in this draft template. And you can see it just goes through all of that information. Instead of attrition, I'd say withdrawal rates down here. You could say attrition instead if you want. Attrition rates and anticipated reasons for attrition. But withdrawal is, attrition is the term we use, it's the more technical term, but here I use withdrawal just because it's a little, attrition is a technical term. And so, for example, when I was first starting college, I don't think I would have known what that meant, especially in the context of research. So when I wrote up the draft, I switched to a little more common term, withdrawal. So on to the actual focus here, the measures section. What I want you to do, so you should be using, most of you will be using a measure that I've already filled out all the information for you. So here, instead of having you outline what's already outlined, I have you go ahead and try writing up the whole paragraph. So the paragraph over here is going to look essentially the same as the paragraph over here. So let me stick over here on the draft because it makes things a little easier. So here, for the name of the measure, you'll actually use what's called a level 3 heading. So I formatted it again according to the 6th manual. You hear me say this a lot because I have no idea what's going to change. And so this could all be a little bit different by the time you see it. The first time you introduce a measure name, if there's a shortened form, you use the shortened form. If you have already used the term, it's tough because technically once you've introduced an abbreviation, you are never supposed to use the full term. But let's say you talked about this particular measure in your introduction, then I might write out the full name of the measure here, but I wouldn't necessarily include this abbreviation because you've already introduced the abbreviation in the paper. You need to have a reference to show at least one reference showing where this study, where can I trace back to find out more about how this measure was developed. Because we don't just make up questions. We make sure that measures, that the questions are all kind of consistent, that if a person answers one way on one question, they answer kind of similarly on the other questions that are meant to all measure one thing. And there's often some analysis of how the different scales work, if there are different scales, or even just checking to make sure all of the, do the questions seem to form, are there 3 questions that are consistent and then another 5 that are consistent for something else, but the 2 groups are different from each other. So we want to be able to go back and look to see, is this actually a good measure? or are you using foot size to measure reading, which might work in some situations but is not a very effective overall strategy. Pay attention to what information you're adding. So here I've left out, if you look at the measure templates where you see the information about each measure, there's more information than what I'm putting here. If you are, for example, if you're using it with a different language population, you want to specify that. If it's a specific age group. Now I let you fudge that for these papers often. I'll let you use measures that were meant for adults with kids, just because at some level we need to keep it manageable as a class. But just be aware that, let's say you almost any of these measures, if you're using it with a kid, that's something that probably should be mentioned in your limitations. That this is a scale that's really developed for adults and may not function correctly with kids. Some of the articles you read might not include all of this information, but if you read higher quality journals, the ones with lower acceptance rates, meaning for every 100 articles submitted, maybe 5 or 10 of them get accepted. So the choosier journals, they will have most of this information written up. And if you're doing an academic, like a thesis or dissertation, you'll almost always have this kind of information listed. So how many items, and kind of how do people respond? What are people responding? A sample item, at least one sample item, telling me how scores, what happens. So do they get averaged? Do they get added up or summed? And what do high scores mean what? Or low scores mean what? So in this case, higher scores indicating more symptoms of PTSD. If there is a cutoff in particular, you want to mention what that is. And then here's a statement. This is something new I've added, so you won't see it when you look at the sample papers. Scale reliability will be reported for the data using Cronbach's alpha. So Cronbach's alpha is a measure of reliability. That's the statistical term for what I've already talked about, where are the questions consistent? If people answer, yes to one question, do they also answer yes to the other questions, typically? You're not going to know what it is, and I don't have you look up the Cronbach's alpha for individual scales. So usually if you look at other articles that are using this scale, so typically a proposal would say what Cronbach's alpha has been found to be in the past, but that's just adding a little more complication than I think we need here. So instead, just mention that after you've collected the data. So theoretically, if you were actually doing this study, once you've collected the data, you would report back. That's one of the things you would report is Cronbach's alpha. And that usually goes here where you talked about the measure. Sometimes you can stick it in results, but typically it goes here where you're talking about the measure. So in this case, you don't really do an outline and a draft because you've already got the outline information. Again, you can check sample questions. The only sample papers, the only thing that's really going to be different is this last statement. And you don't need to pick and choose things. Just stick that statement on at the end. You don't need to completely understand what it is. I just want to start setting good habits and expectations of what sorts of things go into an article. And this is something you probably, I doubt you'll cover in stats, and I doubt you may not even cover it in experimental psych, but if you go on to grad school, particularly into a research-oriented program, I want to plant a seed that this is a thing that you'll talk about there. All right, next video we'll talk about the procedures. Bye-bye.